Thanks for joining us on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Former President Donald Trump is facing a series of civil and criminal legal investigations in several different states. It's a lot to parse through, so which one of these cases are the ones that you should really be paying attention to? Our 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor tells us. Here's our chat with Whitney.
We're now joined by 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor for a bit more about some of the investigations into Donald Trump, the ongoing investigations into the former president, and whether or not any of them could lead to further litigation and or a perhaps conviction down the road of the former president. So Whitney, we've been hearing, the reason we've got you on is we've been hearing, I think, a fair bit more noise of late about these investigations concerning Donald Trump. I think it can be confusing to the average viewer about which ones maybe matter more so than others. Could you give us a bit more on the latest at where we're at with all these, please?
Sure thing. And there's so many different cases going on, and they're actually somewhat related, but somewhat unrelated. Some are criminal and some are civil. So the issues in the lawsuits that are going on, I think there's about 4 or 5. One is the Department of Justice is looking into the documents taken at Mar-a-Lago. And there are about 11,000 documents seized. A lot of them were classified as privileged, some even as top secret. And there's currently an independent, a special counsel looking at those documents to determine if they're privileged or not. But in that case, President Trump is looking at violating the Espionage Act, actually, which is when you keep national security information that could be used to injure the U.S. So that's one issue. Then in New York, you have both a civil and criminal case. On the civil case is Letitia James, the Attorney General. For the last 3 years, she has been investigating essentially the Trump organization. And it really boils down to, this isn't unusual, but for business in some regard, where a business will present its financials to a bank looking much better so that they can get a loan or get a loan with a better interest rate. But then when they file their taxes, they show a loss or things looking much worse. So that's what essentially the Trump organization is being accused of in that case. On the civil side, a lawsuit was actually filed in September, and last week a judge actually put essentially an oversight into the Trump organizations while this litigation's pending. Criminally, there's a Manhattan DA that's looking at essentially the same issues on the criminal side. So that's ongoing. Then there's former President Trump's role in the January 6th insurrection. And so there, the congressional committee is actually ordered him to testify. That's in a dispute. The congressional committee itself doesn't have really much power other than to investigate and prepare its report, but it is getting ready to release, I think in December, over 1,000 pages of transcripts of interviews. These are with witnesses who did cooperate, Trump attorneys and etc. And then finally is in Fulton County, Georgia.
Yeah.
Right. The district attorney there, Fani Willis, who was a classmate of mine. We went to law school together. Very good attorney. She's looking at prosecuting for essentially election violations in Georgia, primarily related to the phone call that President Trump had with the Secretary of State regarding the 11,000 votes in Georgia that he wanted.
No, he kind of famously said, "Find me." Yes. Sorry, I think there's a half-second delay there, but to what you were alluding, I think it's where he kind of famously said to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, said, "Find 11,800 votes" or something like that.
Right. Yeah. And that whole conversation, it was an hour-long conversation. I've actually listened to the whole thing, and that is obviously evidence. And in that case, the governor was actually, Brian Kemp, was subpoenaed. He fought back on the subpoena, and the judge said, "Why until the midterm elections, after the midterm, you have to testify. So he's going to also testify. And that's one thing about all of these cases. You know, the FBI, the DOJ, a lot of them sort of sat on everything a month or two leading up to the midterms, I think, to maybe try to not influence them. And now you're going to see several of them ramp up.
So with that said, you mentioned there's clearly a lot of litigation, pending litigation ongoing with the former president. Which one of these do you think represents the potentially most damage civilly, criminally? Which ones do you think have the highest chances of potential conviction?
Well, honestly, I think the Georgia situation is one of the toughest cases he's going to deal with. The evidence is there. They're going forward on the prosecution. They've been allowed to depose important people. So I think that one for sure. What's happening in New York, I mean, I think that's also damaging both on the civil and criminal side, and that is related to the business dealings. You know, now remember, he's the first president in 40 years, I guess, who hasn't released his tax returns. Now, that whole issue, everybody thought it was political and partisan. Well, that is now becoming fundamentally important because what has been represented on the tax returns is in question about whether they, you know, violated the law. So I think the New York situation and the Georgia situation are going to be the most damaging. The congressional stuff, I think, because they can't really do anything, I don't think that's as damaging or difficult for Trump to deal with. But I do think once the transcripts are released, and I know there's been a bunch of FOIA requests and otherwise, once those are ultimately released, I think that's going to be damaging both politically and potentially criminally.
So what is the threat potential? Donald Trump, of course, announcing earlier on this month that he's planning on running for president again. What is the potential damage from a political standpoint, purely from a legal standpoint, from strictly a legal standpoint? What is the damage to him? Do you think that his run for president could be complicated by this?
His run for president is definitely complicated by this and complicates this situation because there was an issue even when he was in office, and there were concerns about what he did on January 6th until he was out of office. And people were, and of course, during the times that he got impeached, they were looking at this issue of self-pardons, right? And so the only time this really has come up is with President Nixon. And at the time, President Nixon's lawyer suggested that a self-pardon would be in order. But the DOJ ultimately issued a memo way back then saying a sitting president cannot pardon himself. Of course, we don't have any precedent. And so here he's not a sitting president. He's a former president. And there's a lot of scholarship that says a former president is just like an everyday citizen. Others will say, well, the executive privilege and things like that will protect him. So now if former President Trump runs again and is elected, then you do have the issue of self-pardon and can you prosecute a sitting president? But presumably all of this would happen well before the 2024 election. So, but this is exactly why, you know, Merrick Garland, he's the Attorney General. He runs the Department of Justice, which is the attorneys for the United States. And technically, I guess Joe Biden is his boss, but at the same time, the DOJ is independent from the president. And so once President Trump announced he was running in 2024, Merrick Garland then appointed a special counsel to pursue the DOJ investigation into the documents stolen and what have you, to avoid the appearance of it being political, saying, hey, President Biden's DOJ is now going after President Trump, his potential opponent in 2024. So I think that makes sense. Merrick Garland is known for being thorough, for being careful, for being prudent. So the special counsel makes sense.
I guess legally, based on some of the things you're saying here, and it sounds with some of these things like the Espionage Act and the ability whether or not to charge a former president, it seems like there's a lot of potentially some gray area there, both legally, certainly politically. I guess the bit of subjective commentary I might add is that Trump has a tendency to kind of skirt the law without maybe at times explicitly breaking, or at least that's perhaps the perception. Do you think that's the case with what's going on right now?
Absolutely. And he is very skilled at using time, using the bully pulpit to his advantage. I mean, he has now said, well, this is politically motivated. With Letitia James, for example, she's the Black woman in New York who's an attorney general. Well, he said, this is political motivated. She said before she was even elected that she was going to prosecute me. And he's even claimed racism, saying she's doing this because he's white and she's Black. So he's just throwing everything at, the wall and seeing what sticks. The other thing that he's using quite skillfully is he's using time. With every possible delay. He showed up at one deposition and pled the fifth the entire time. Even though he said, pardons and pleading the fifth and all this suggests guilt. He's saying, look, you should just be out front and accountable. But now he's doing that. So he's using, it's just like when he filed for bankruptcy. He would never, based on his ego, he would never say, oh, well, my businesses are not doing well, I had to file for bankruptcy. What he said was, I've used the bankruptcy laws to my advantage. So what he said was, hey, I got around it. And you may remember when Hillary Clinton accused him of not paying his taxes. And he said, well, that's smart. I got around it. So he exploits systems to the extent he can. And here he is. But importantly, Chris, even if he's having these delays and pushing back and fighting on technicalities, that's not unusual. He has the resources to do it. He likes to fight. That's his disposition. But in these cases, there are judges who are going to make rulings. And these are both judges that were Democrats and Republicans, some that were appointed by him. And for example, he just appealed the case dealing with, I think it was the one in which he had to sit for a deposition and they were fighting it. He lost that. They appealed it. He lost on appeal. So what I'm saying is that there are objective, third parties, judges looking at these issues, and they're ruling against, sometimes for him, but many times against him. So eventually there will be a day in court is what I'm anticipating.
Well, I guess we'll find out with all this pending litigation ongoing, as you mentioned, so carefully outlined for it, Whitney. So more importantly, thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus and giving us a detailed idea about what's going on right now and what we can expect coming up in the next few weeks, next few months, perhaps next few years. So thank you, Whitney.
For sure. And I'll be glad to be back, because these issues, as they get decided, we don't have precedent. We don't have situations where presidents and former presidents have been entangled in this way. So this is good, because this also helps us to develop our body of law, our case law, our common law, as we move forward as a relatively young country.
Interesting indeed. And I'm sure we will certainly learn some lessons from this one way or the other moving forward on a legal basis. So Whitney, thank you for again detailing some of that and joining us here on 90s Plus today.
For sure. Good to be here.